Greetings, Algebra. I have completed the graphic organizer for atoms and molecules, we're talking about ionic and covalent bonds. So here's my example. I have put it inside a notebook, even so that you can see that. So we have the first thing here is atoms, and we've defined atoms in class before. But if you forget, an atom is the smallest unit of matter. It comes from the Greek word for indivisible because it was believed that it is the smallest form of a substance that is still that substance. Now, that's not exactly true, but it's the smallest bit of matter that can be broken down without releasing an electric charge. So here I have an example of beryllium, and I color-coded my protons, electrons, and neutrons there. So you notice in the nucleus, I have the protons and neutrons. Beryllium's interesting because in its most commonly found state, it has 4 protons, but 5 neutrons. So you'll notice in this picture here that it has 5 neutrons and 4 protons. And I drew it to be electrically balanced, so it doesn't have a charge. So since it has 4 protons, it also has 4 electrons. And I even drew in the orbits. This is an example of a Niels Bohr diagram where the orbits are drawn in. Now the Niels Bohr diagram is probably not the most accurate. Electrons are usually flying around the nucleus of the atom in what we call a cloud, often also referred to as a shell. But the important thing to notice in here, which is important for how bonds are made, especially covalent bonds, is the number of electrons in each shell. In the first shell closest to the nucleus, an atom can have at most 2 electrons. So here we have 2 electrons in the first shell. After that, they will have usually 8 electrons in their valent shell. So they will want to have 8. So this has 2 electrons in the outermost shell. The outermost shell is called, where the valence electrons are located. So over here we have molecules. My screen is mirrored so I can see it, but that's kind of messing with my sense of direction. Molecules are a group of atoms that are bonded together. So often we don't see things in their elemental state, where it's just one element. We often see them as a group of atoms that are bonded together. So for example, water. Water is not an element, but water is a molecule because it has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And they are electrically neutral. That is what a molecule is. So we're going to be learning about 2 different forms of bonds. And so in our first form of bond, we're going to be talking about ions. An ion is a charged atom, an atom that has a charge. An atom can get a charge in 2 different ways. It can either gain an electron, and since electrons are negative, that gives the atom a negative charge, or it can lose an electron. And when it loses an electron, that gives it a positive charge. A positive charged ion is called a cation, and a negatively charged ion is called an anion. So going on down here, we have ionic bonds. So here I have an example of an ionic bond. So the most common example for us is table salt. Oh, need to find my finger. There we go. So table salt is sodium chloride. So the sodium, Na, wants to give up an electron, and chlorine's like, hey, I want an electron. So it takes the electron, but then we have a positively charged atom and a negatively charged atom, and opposites attract, so they bond together. So ionic bonding happens when a negatively charged atom and a positively charged atom attract each other. And so here we have some more examples. And so table salt, sodium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium oxide, potassium bromide, And those are all examples. Now, here we have a rule of thumb, and of course there's always an exception, but usually ionic bonds almost always have one metal, at least one metal. So here, sodium is a metal that's combining with chlorine. Great, so that is ionic bonds. Next, let's talk about covalent bonds. So let's build our terminology. And so we have electrons. Electrons, as you recall, were the negatively charged particles in an atom. The outermost shell is where the valence electrons live. And except for the insidemost shell, all of them really want to have 8. That's where the atoms are happy, where they all have 8. So sometimes that leads to ionic bonding, because if there's one extra electron, they'll try to get rid of that extra electron. Sometimes when you're missing one electron, they'll steal an electron from somebody else. However, when it's not really easy to just grab one, that's where we get covalent bonding. And here we have our definition of a Niels Bohr diagram. So it's a diagram that shows an atom and shows different levels. So again, that's the example of the Niels Bohr diagram there of my beryllium atom. So here, let's go into covalent bonds. A molecule is formed with a covalent bond when two atoms share valence electrons. So instead of giving up an electron and the other one taking the electron, they actually share, so then it makes both atoms happy. So here we have examples, and most common is water, H2O. And then we also have oxygen. Oxygen is an element itself, but it's not usually found with just a single oxygen atom. It's usually bounded together with another oxygen atom to make O2. Then we also have ammonia and chlorine. Chlorine does the same thing where it binds to itself. And so again, our rule of thumb with this one is that usually, in almost every case, they're non-metals. So two non-metals joining together forms covalent bonds. And there we have our example of the graphic organizer. Have a great day, science.